You're listening to the Yeshiva of Newark at IDT podcast. I'm your host and curator, Rabbi Kivelevitz, and I hope you enjoy this episode. You've bought your tickets. The ushers are about to open the doors. Yes, the Projectionist has Semicha is about to start. But first, if you own a retail business and accept credit cards, your customers are getting points, miles, and all sorts of rewards every time they use their card, and you're paying the price. That's why NRS Pay, a product of National Retail Solutions, a division of the IDT Corporation, offers its cash discount program FeeBuster. You can start accepting credit cards for free. If your business processes over $18,000 a month, you pay no monthly fee and $0 out of your pocket for transaction. This means you, as a retailer, can enjoy the benefits of accepting plastic, and your customers still get those crucial miles they crave and need. NRS Pay FeeBuster provides every client with a free credit card reader with no long-term contract, no early termination fee, cancel anytime without a penalty. I'm personally familiar with this company, and they truly stand by their product, and they'll help you with live, stateside-based customer service on any issue or question. Visit nrspay.com or call 833-289-2767 to learn more about NRS Pay and the fantastically fair FeeBuster. Clear the aisles, the Projectionist has Semicha. Hi, I'm here with Rabbi Kolakowski. 2 days after the Super Bowl, and I know Yitzchak is not a Super Bowl fan, but there was something about the Super Bowl that got me thinking, which I think really takes us into at least the first part of today's show, and maybe even the whole program. The Jason Kelce, who was on the Philadelphia Eagles, and a lot was made of the fact that Jason and his brother Travis were playing, and Jason, they were asking him, is he going to retire or not? So this is what Jason said. He said, the end of the season is not a time to make a decision, but right now I'm fully exhausted mentally, physically, emotionally, and it's getting harder every year. I'm nowhere near the player I used to be. And then he said, it's only going to go the other way. And whether you can be accountable to your teammates and perform at that level and mentally have the difference to be the difference maker. So it got me thinking that we celebrate these sportsmen, but they themselves know that their time is very limited on that stage. Jason Kelce is in his 30s, and he's already talking about that it's going the other way. Because in that sport, youth, which translates into speed, strength, dexterity, energy, it's only there for a certain amount of time. You have the outliers like Brady and others who could go into their 40s, but most football players are spent after a very young age. They're there to be lionized and to be admired, but of course, even without the brutal aspect of the game, the fact of how the toll that it takes on bones and sinews and muscles, the point is it's something that flashes for a while. And of course, many of these people afterwards, they are ambassadors and they become coaches, perhaps. They go into movies like Jim Brown and other Fred Williamson and other football players, Bubba Smith, who tried to go into acting. But we realized that in sports, we realized that this is a magic moment that sports person has, the youth and the age. It goes together. And afterwards, it's only memories and things they can write books about. Many times it's of child actors and actresses and how they have navigated the roles to adulthood. And I mentioned Roddy McDowell the other day, that I never thought he ever navigated it as successful as he was as a young actor. Elizabeth Taylor, of course, is different. She showed tremendous promise as a youngster, and then, of course, became one of the greatest actresses or movie stars of her time. But what it made me think about was also something else in the Super Bowl. There was a commercial, which I caught. The last 12 minutes is all I saw of the Super Bowl, but I was enough to see a commercial for T-Mobile, and a familiar jingle and song came into my head. It was the Summer Lovin' song from Grease, I've never seen the film, but I've heard all the soundtrack. And of course, the song was sung originally in the movie by Olivia Newton-John and John Travolta. And here was the music, basically the same words, but trying to pitch T-Mobile and trying to push T-Mobile. And there was this bald guy with a beard, but the face, it was rounded. There was, I guess, somewhat of a punch. It was Travolta. Here was Travolta, 40-something years later, singing that song. And at the very end of the commercial, striking the pose that made him famous in Saturday Night Fever off pod, that you remembered him from Welcome Back, Kotter. He was part of the Sweat Hogs that Gabe Kaplan taught. But clearly that television appearances that he had meant that people in Hollywood or the movie makers saw something there. I think what they saw was some talent, some ability to act, but more of that, they saw a hunk, they saw sensuality, they saw a person that would be a heartthrob. There was just something about his face, his mannerisms, that oozed the idea of being easy and ready, someone people would be attracted to. And that's why Travolta really catapulted into films. Now, is Travolta ever going to be considered one of the great movie stars? I am the film that I remember most from Travolta's oeuvre is the Brian De Palma film Blowout, which is basically a very much of a Hitchcock Truffaut type of film. De Palma was always borrowing from everybody. I remember Travolta was in that, and again, but Travolta really, I think, had a hard time after he was this young, sensuous stud to sort of make that jump, to go into still be an actor, to still carry the weight of what made him attractive and continue throughout as age takes its toll. There's just so much makeup and prosthetics and toupees can do. And well, yes, well, Travolta is still a known person, even in he still perhaps could earn a lot of money for T-Mobile, but he is an example, and I think there's others, of people that were pushed into movies and TV because they had that it quality. But that it quality was as fleeting as Jason Kelce understands his own physical strength and ability and speed and stamina to be. We've talked about Burt Lancaster together. I've recommended Elmer Gantry as a great film to watch, and especially because of his Burt Lancaster's deserved Oscar-winning performance. But Elmer Gantry was made in 1960. Burt Lancaster was born in 1913, and he came into film somewhat on the late side, not in his 20s, not in his teens. He came in the late side. He was already in his 30s, maybe even sort of till his mid-30s, till people saw him on screen. And a number of very, very, really impressive, powerful film noirs that were made post-World War II, directed by who we talked about last week, Robert Siodmak. He also made another film for Siodmak called, under Siodmak's direction, Criss Cross. Brute Force, which was a film that we've talked about before here, where he was in prison versus Hume Crone. A number of very impressive films where you would say he was just this beefcake. But unlike Travolta, I think Lancaster understood that he needed to develop more skills than just how he could, make his face look sensual. He developed the skills of an actor, and almost of a character actor, even where he was playing the main part. Now he didn't always, you didn't always buy it. You didn't always in I think it was in Come Back Little Sheba, which I think was in the early 50s, where he's under makeup, but you can see the sensual power that he has. He's still very much of a machismo, where he's married to the frumpy Shirley Booth. And he plays a chiropractor married to Shirley Booth, and they have a marriage sort of convenience and understanding, and you can see that Lancaster feels trapped in that marriage, and the film is really, Lancaster plays it a very understated type of performance. It was, and he, I don't know if those films that he made trying to go against his type were that successful, but he at least was trying to discover a different part of himself, because the part of himself that came out in the 40s was explosive, was fearlessness, was a sense of determination, was and it moved through him because he had been a performer in a circus. Him and his friend Nick Cravat had been part of the K circus. He was able to do tumbling, much more than Cary Grant. We talked about his history, but he was able to do acts that he, and of course, in the film Trapeze that he made in the early 50s, he did a number of his own stunts. And that's what you got when you saw Lancaster. Bogart always had a body double, like in any film. And Bogart, whoever it was, Bogart, Cagney, Tim Holt, you can always tell if you look carefully that it's a different person. Not so with Lancaster. Lancaster was someone who was really, in many ways, a throwback to Harold Lloyd and some of the other stars who did their own stunts. Now, there were some times where maybe the director had to step in, but the filmmaking had advanced to a point, especially with some of these filmmakers who wanted to get these type of close-up shots. You could see the type of acrobatic things that Lancaster was doing that really made the film so exciting. The movie The Pirate and others, but even in the film noirs, you can tell it's Lancaster himself that's going through the fake fighting, and he's not somebody you want to fight with. He had this pent-up power that you have to be scared of. And even though he might not have always been the most well-educated person, but there was a sense of humanity and understanding, a common sense that he was able to exude in a way that made him beyond, I think, just the type of person that, we're waiting for him to take his shirt off. He was someone who I think was able to set in motion in the beginning part of his career what would later become his bread and butter as he got older. Now, in the 50s, he was a very popular star. He played in one of the versions of the Gunfight of the OK Corral together with, he was together, of course, with Kirk Douglas. He was with Kirk Douglas in 7 films. But I don't think Douglas, although Douglas was a very strong and important actor, Douglas did not really have that type of appeal that Lancaster had. Douglas was a star, and he was a person who could carry a film, but not in the sort of the Vinnie Barbarino, Robert Mitchum style that Lancaster had. He was that total package. And in films where both of them were together, it always seemed to me that Kirk Douglas, despite his personal strength, was somehow in the shadow of Burt Lancaster. Lancaster and Douglas both had a desire to create, and this was where the studio system was starting to sort of peel away at that time in the 50s and the late 40s and 50s, and they had their own independent production companies. They sometimes had to use studio lots and other things to make that happen, but both Lancaster and Douglas were part of that new trend. Bogart, of course, eventually also had his own production company, but Lancaster, throughout his whole filmmaking life, had his own production company, and for a while, it was very successful. They produced a number of interesting films where Lancaster would do things differently than perhaps in the standard studio. One of these films, in fact, the first one, is what I wanted to talk about, the film from Nightlands. Many people, when they hear this title, say, "Well, that's such a great title." right? Because so many of us have blood on our hands for things we've done, and somehow the relationships that we get into is a way to sort of kiss that blood off, that somehow I can find within love a way that I can forget about my past. Now, it's based on an English novel of the same name, and it really is a wonderful film to watch. It is a film where Lancaster is the only American. And again, they sort of mentioned that he was a Canadian or he wants to go back to Canada. There's always something about, you talked about the 39 steps. There's always something about when it's sort of a person who doesn't have an English accent, he's somehow either a Canadian in some ways, but he plays an American, and an American who, as the film develops, you see that he has been a GI. He had been in a Nazi prison camp, although that comes out, very much in the middle of the film. And he jumped ship as if he did not want to continue in the army or in the Navy or whatever sort of station where he was. And he ends up in a London bar, and this is where the film opens. And the first 10 minutes are really wonderfully shot. It is you're in a film noir. It's dark. There's a fight, and here you have Lancaster being told to leave the bar, and when the person decides to touch him, the barkeeper, and gets a little bit physical with him, Lancaster reacts. He's like a coiled spring, and his fist rockets out to the jaw of the barkeep, and the barkeep falls over and hits his head on some metal or some object, which kills him. And then Lancaster runs out of the bar, and the first 10 minutes of the film is a very exciting chase scene that was filmed on the Universal Studio lot. It was supposed to be London at night. But there's someone who witnesses the quote unquote murder. And that is someone that we've talked about here on our program, Robert Newton, who was in Obsession. That was the film about the guy who wanted to put his wife's lover into this room and torture him there for all that time and kill him and have him die and have him disappear. It was that's a great film also. But here's Robert Newton way over the top. In that film, Robert Newton is almost like a dignified Englishman who is diabolical. In this film, made 1 year later, he is a Cockney accent to the sky. Now, Robert Newton, of course, was in David Lean's version of Oliver Twist, together with the terrible portrayal of Fagin by Alec Guinness, terrible as far as we Jews go. But and Robert Newton played Bill Sykes, who, of course, is one of the wife beater in Oliver Twist. And in this film, however, he is a great heavy, because you know that he is a black marketeer who's going to somehow cash in on the fact that he knows something about this guy. This guy escapes the police, but somehow Robert Newton's character, whose name is Harry, or Addie, Addie, is going to somehow make use of this violent, powerful American. As he's ducking into the ins and outs of the alleys of London, he ends up somehow in the small apartment of Joan Fontaine, whose name is Jane Warren. I believe was the surprise for me in this film, how well she pulls this off. She was actually a bit younger than Lancaster. She, of course, and her sister, Olivia de Havilland, were raised by English parents. So the film could make a claim that everybody in this film is a real Englishman. That was part of how it was different than some of these phony English films that we have talked about before. But Joan Fontaine plays a woman who has had her lover die in the war. He was a member of the RAF. And now she tries to dedicate her life to helping people. It's interesting, Yitzchak, that just like the film The Third Man, Graham based on the Graham Greene novel directed by Carol Reed. Penicillin plays a very important role here. In all of these post-war films, it was clear that the country was still hobbling and was not in its state to be able to be 100%. Besides penicillin, there's also you see a lot of real details, like ration. The ration tickets were given out in the place of money. There's a scene where Lancaster, playing this fellow called Bill Saunders, realizes that he's on the run and he has no money, and he mugs someone and takes his wallet. And when you see what's in the wallet, you see most of it is just the rations that were still being used even a number of years after World War II had ended. But as I said, England had it a little bit better than what was going on in the rest of the continent, France and other places. And therefore, the penicillin that was being produced and being distributed by Joan Fontaine's hospital ends up being a key aspect of this film, because that is something that Newton wants to get his hands on. And just like, it turns out that Lancaster, after he finds refuge with her, she doesn't report him to the police. She somehow is obviously attracted to Lancaster the same way every girl in the audience was attracted to Lancaster. There's something about him. Turns out that he never got past the 6th grade. She's able to see in a number of scenes his violent nature, his tendency. But as with trips to the zoo and other places that were, I think, filmed in Griffith Park and in California, there was supposed to be the zoo in London. I'm not sure what the name of the zoo that's in the heart of London, but it turns out that how he hates the cages, how when the animals are roaring in the cages and getting their meat, he's having an intense reaction without doing any flashbacks. But she's able to see that this is someone who's suffering from what we would call, it's clear that he's suffering from PTSD, what we would call it today. And her medical training allows her to overcome her disgust to his rough aspect and to somehow be sympathetic to him. There is a great scene where they're coming home from an outing where she experienced what it means to bet on a horse. A really wonderful scene, and I guess it must have been Santa Anita Racetrack where they filmed it. And Joan Fontaine is a little demure, small girl, and Lancaster puts her up on his shoulders so she could see the horse racing. On their way back, in a train that they were taking back to London, Lancaster gets into a fight with someone who wants to share their room, and it comes out with a simple little story about showing a little card trick where Lancaster was trying to hustle the fellow and use the card trick to sort of get money from him. And when the person didn't want to do it, Lancaster explodes again in anger and is about to throttle the person. When Joan Fontaine's character sees this, she realizes that she's dealing with someone who is so violent that she doesn't want anything to do with him. He runs through the streets. He assaults a policeman. The policemen get him, and there's a scene where he appears in front of a British magistrate, and he's sentenced to 6 months of hard labor. But beforehand, because of his violent nature, he is sentenced to flogging with a cat o' nine tails. And here is the scene where, again, it's shot by the director Norman Foster, who was a protege of Orson Welles. I know he made a lot of really inferior Disney films, I think, towards the end of his career. And he made in this early part of his career, he was one of the key directors of the Mr. Moto franchise, starring, of course, our good friend Pierre Lorre. But in this, Foster was very close to Orson Welles, and in a sort of like a lot of Wellesian touches in the film, but especially this one where he goes into this house, this base on Mishpat, and you can see him ripping his shirt off, as I said, and being flogged. But at least in prison, it seems like his character is able to realize what he has done wrong up to a point, and he yearns for the kindness that he was able to find with Joan Fontaine. And after he's in prison and comes out of prison, he goes to her house, but she's also searches for him, and she finds him, and it turns out that she gets him a job driving the trucks that, of course, have the penicillin. And here is where you have everything hitting the fan, where the blackmailer, Robert Newton, comes in and says that he's going to, now that he already has a prison record here, if he'll snitch on him and he'll get the barmaid to identify him, he'll hang in prison. And he uses that in order to get him into this big caper that he was going to able to make a lot of money that on the black market with the penicillin. Suffice to say that the tension builds when it turns out the night that he's meant to make the drop and pretend that he got beaten up on the way, Joan Fontaine decides to come with him. And by this time, they've expressed their love to each other and how much they mean to each other, and how, as difficult of a life that he's had, as angry as he is, the only thing of stability that he has is her love. And she realizes how much she has missed a man, how much, even though she's doing good for the people and she's trying to be this demure, dedicated woman for the good of the country, she realizes how much the love of this powerhouse means to her. And I'm not going to, spoil exactly what happens here, but suffice to say that there's a great scene with Robert Newton and Joan Fontaine, where, you can see, as the film says, a little bit of Lancaster's animal masculinity even seeps through her, into her. I really think it's really one of Joan Fontaine's better performances, and it really is very typical of what Lancaster brought to the screen, the type of power, the type of energy, and why, although you wouldn't say he's a Spencer Tracy everyman, like people tell you about Jimmy Stewart or Tom Hanks, he was, in a way, a super everyman. And I think that's really what he ended up continuing doing while he was experimenting with a person with deep flaws, with a character that didn't need to always be explicated by some exposition. I've talked about Wayne and the Searchers, but Wayne was not capable of the type of emotional power that Lancaster was able to bring to the screen. I really think Wayne's Oscar in True Grit was pretty much a sympathy Oscar. He was an icon, but he was not the artistic artist that Lancaster was. And it could be the tipping point where Lancaster sort of starts to get into more what we would call character roles. It might have been From Here to Eternity, where he sort of, again, that is like an all-star cast. It has Deborah Kerr and Montgomery Clift and Burt Lancaster, and Montgomery Clift also was a person who was brought to the screen because he sort of was like a pretty boy, a sensual pretty boy. People didn't realize, of course, that he was gay and other things, and he had a lot of mental issues, which Lancaster kept under control. But I think after From Here to Eternity, as you get into the 60s with 7 Days in May, Hosanna's Raid, The Swimmer, which is one of the craziest films, except Burt was, naked, jumping into water everywhere and swimming. But, he was able, I think, to retain that star quality as a character. Someone pointed out to me when I told them what I was going to speak about today, that even in some of his last films, like, well, Atlantic City, of course, he was sort of, here he was again, the possible sensual power as he lusts after Susan Sarandon there. But Local Hero, some of these films, or Field of Dreams, where he is in a way the nominal star, although Kevin Costner is the one who sort of is the person who builds the stadium. Lancaster, I think, dominates. And I think it's something he was able to do. And part of it, I think, was, I said, part of it was because of what he was able to mine out of himself. And this is really reflected in his life as well. He was a very much a liberal person. He was very much against the House Un-American Committee. He protested against it. He was very vocal in the civil rights movement. He and his wife famously hosted Martin Luther King and his wife the night before the March on Washington. He took part in the March on Washington. He spoke. He was a proud member of the ACLU, very much a liberal person, but a tough liberal, very different than Charlton Heston, who sort of became a star in Hollywood a couple of years after Lancaster. I mentioned Charlton Heston not only because of their difference in politics, but also because Heston's, of course, most famous role was as Moses in the Ten Commandments. Maybe you could say Ben-Hur is just as famous, but Lancaster actually, and I remember when this movie came out in 1974 in a made-for-TV quote-unquote miniseries, Lancaster played Moses the lawgiver. And that wasn't the only Jewish part that Lancaster played. Lancaster was familiar with Jews. He was born in Manhattan. He was very familiar, of course, with Hollywood and many Jewish people and many Jewish friends, including Kirk Douglas, of course. But Lancaster actually played two other Jews besides Moses, like the ultimate Jew. He also played Shimon Peres in Operation Thunderbolt, which is a movie, Yitzchak, you might know, that they used to play in camps all the time in the summer during Tisha B'Av. That was like the movie that they would show. It was, of course, about the Entebbe raid. He played Shimon Peres, and also in a movie that was made towards the end of his career, he played Leon Klinghoffer. Who was killed on the Aquila Lauro. He's killed by Palestinian terrorists. So he was a person who played Jews and played very important ones. People who later became president of Israel, the leader of Klal Yisrael, person who died, Al Kiddush Hashem, but that's Burt. And I think that that's he was almost born with a name that needed to be put on the screen. He didn't have to change his name like Kirk Douglas or Tony Curtis, who was also a very good friend of his. Burt Lancaster, born with that with a name that seethed power, and he continued the whole way.
One more movie with Lancaster, which was an interesting one, was The Island of Dr. Moreau, which I guess might have been his only like a science fiction or horror movie. And to me, the greatest version of that movie would be the version with Charles Lawton and Bela Lugosi. But they say that the version that he was in the 1970s was more true to H.G. Wells's novel, and especially one aspect of it was that he actually looked like how the part was written in the novel, as opposed to Lawton, and then later
I can't, very few authors would probably describe such a character of magnetism with the features of Charles Lawton. Burt Lancaster had looks that were unique but classic. He was and you can see even in his old age, you could see the strength of his jaw, the prominence of his eyes. Somebody that was really very much an arresting presence of power.
That's what you really see in this movie, but it's just not. In a certain sense, though, it's not as Lawton. He really, he was chewing the scenery of that movie,
Yes.
as he always did, and then Brando did it also, which was not as good. But this was
fellows. I think Lancaster was able to exhibit the slow fuse burning. Like, you always knew there's something. When is it going to happen? When is he going to explode? How much of it is he going to take? And you have that in a number of his films where he's so affable, he's so personable, he's someone who can charm anyone, but yet there's something waiting to happen. And I think that's part of what he brought where he does play a villain, is that he can have that mannered gentility, but that there's something under the surface. And maybe part of it, Yitzchak, is that when people saw these films, it's the combined memory of this person that you've seen in other films. I think that's what happens automatically when you have a person who's a star, like a Brando, or especially Burt Lancaster. When he played in these later roles, I think you're waiting to see elements of some of those earlier films. But again, he was felled, unfortunately, by a stroke. But till that stroke, he was very, very active, and took his parts, and he was, he was willing to still be that star. But we've got another Burt who I guess we're being misabel for. I guess we're still in the Shiva for of a different Burt that you wanted to talk about.
So yeah, just really, I was only thinking about him because he just passed away. Was Burt Bacharach? I don't know if he might have been a distant cousin from the Chavos Yair. I don't know that I don't know, but he I didn't realize what an impact he had on the musical world. Some certain things you only start to appreciate afterwards. Because I always thought of him not as anything so significant, and then reading about his story and his work really opened up my eyes to a lot of things. But the one movie that I really would have associated him with was, I think, the first time any of his music was used in a movie, as far as I know, was the Blob. And that was the movie that really came to my mind when I heard that Bacharach passed away. I was like, oh, we could. It was an excuse to talk about the Blob, and also about a friend of mine who was also a musician, also who passed away last year. Chris Yeworth, whose father was the director of the Blob, and he was part of the crew. And he has a lot. He had a lot of very interesting stories and things that he always shared with us over the years at Monster Bash. And it was, we knew he was very sick, and it was sad. I think actually Chris's mother, who I believe is still alive, wrote most of the incidental music and everything, and the love theme to the Blob. But the theme of the Blob, which is a funny song, "Beware of the Blob," that was credited to Burt Bacharach, and it really shows his versatility, that he was able to do really touch so many genres of music. One of the things that was brought up in a lot of the discussions about his work was the fact that his music is often called easy listening, and he said, well, it wasn't easy writing. He put in so much work based on his expertise. Even though he was Jewish, he didn't really have much connection to any Yiddishkeit. He said, even though he grew up in Queens, most of his friends growing up were not Jewish, and he didn't really want them to even know that he was Jewish. And I don't know how much he knew what that meant. But the interesting thing was his very dear friend Marlene Dietrich noted that he enjoyed very much visiting different countries to appreciate the music of the different countries. And one of those countries was Israel, because of the musical appreciation that Israelis have without how much he produced. As one of the film critics that I listened to on the radio mentioned that he was the writer of really the background music for much of the second part of the 20th century. That and we don't even realize like whether how many different artists, pretty much everybody at some point had some connection to him. Such a prolific composer, and really connecting that with you know an expertise in his field, meaning he was classically trained, and he took that classical training in a direction away from the way he was trained. One of the things that Chava, my wife, is a big, she herself is a very accomplished musician, and she talks often about historically the impact that the Malaysian gamelan had on music when Debussy and others heard this music, and it transfigurated Western music, hearing this very different style of music. And while they all took, in order to do that, they took their classical motifs, and they were affected by this Oriental motif that they had never heard before, and how that affected them, and in a certain sense, that was how Bacharach, he was classically trained, but he rebelled, but he intentionally rebelled, almost like he intentionally rebelled without rebelling, because that was also part. It was like E. Cummings, not using proper grammar, but when we would bring that up in school, they said, yeah, but before you can be E. Cummings, you have to know the rules in order to break them. And the way Bacharach worked was that he managed to break the rules without it sounding like he was breaking the rules, and that was really
really, I mean, if you look at his filmography, I mean, close to 2,000, sort of films that have used some part of his music. I know in the Blob, his name doesn't even show up in the credits, right? But we know, he worked with Hal David, of course, another Jewish fellow. Hal David wrote the lyrics, and I mean, there's so many songs that were inserted into Hollywood films that Bacharach wrote. What's New Pussycat? I think he was also the music in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. It was also Burt Bacharach, and that's that is that
in my head.
Right, that is that's the Oscar winner, which has no connection to the movie at all.
Right, that's a funny thing. You don't think of that. When you think of that song, you don't think of it as a Western. Some of his early works were, The Story of My Life.
Yeah, look, The Look of Love. I mean, most of the songs Yitzhak that I grew up with.
Prayer for You.
Yes. But
Why do birds always appear? And that's
which was the Carpenters. That's called Close to You, and that, of course,
I mean, that
was, of course, the Carpenters.
The early Simpsons, by that time, when the Simpsons were, that music was had a history, but a lot of his songs were in the first classic episodes of the Simpsons in the 90s. Harkening back to when Homer and Marge were younger in the 70s. Those were the songs that really were.
Of course, look, I would tell you, the song that I think we could probably still sing from him is "What the World Needs Now Is Love, Sweet Love. That's the only thing that there's just too little of what the world needs now." Right? That song is, come on, you could sing that on every single day and say, yes, we need more Ava in the Welt. Right? A song that I remember that was also sung everywhere in the early 70s was "Do You Know the Way to San Jose?"
Right. And the fact that he captured, with the way that he used this music. It really, it was,
Yeah,
it was
it's a credit
something.
to Hal David too. I mean, the correct pieces. First of all, a film that was one of my favorites growing up, called After the Fox. It was written. The screenplay was written by Neil Simon. Vittorio De Sica was the Italian director from Italy who made the film, but the music of After the Fox was Burt Bacharach. Peter Sellers again playing a great performance as sort of like this bumbling yet brilliant thief and master of disguise. It's Burt Bacharach's music for it is really sets the tone, perfectly for those films, the 1960s, along with another score that he wrote, which was probably something that you probably heard a lot when you were growing up, the theme to Arthur, Dudley Moore's film.
Once in your life, you find her, someone who turns your heart around, and next thing you know, you're closing down the town. Wake up and it's still with you, even though you left your way across town, wondering to yourself, hey, what have I found? When you get caught between the moon and New York City, I know it's crazy, but it's true. If you get caught between the moon and New York City, best that you can do, best that you can do is fall in love. Arthur, he does as he pleases. All of his life, his master's toys, and deep in his heart, he's just a boy, living his life one day at a time. He's showing himself a pretty good time, laughing about the way they wanted to be. When you get caught between the moon and New York City, I know it's crazy, but it's true. If you get caught between the moon and New York City, best that you can do, best that you can do, best that you can do is fall in love. When you get caught between the moon and New York City, I know it's crazy, but it's true. If you get caught between the moon and New York City, best that you can do, best that you can do, fall in love. When you get caught between the moon and New York City, I know it's crazy, but it's true. If you get caught between the moon and New York City, best that you can do, best that you can do, best that you can do. When you get caught between the moon and New York City.
Wow, that is really a time capsule, Yitzchak. I
And
mean,
it shows the power of hard work.
well, look, Bacharach gets the Oscar along with the two other composers of this piece, but it really does capture the late 70s, early 80s. It really is in many ways the type of, you talk about easy listening, but it really is transportive. Also, even, this I don't know if the song could be written today because we don't have time to hear all that to hear all that variance that song brings. But it's also, I think, one of the best things Bacharach did because it's connected to the film. I mean, Arthur was a person who was wealthy and didn't have a direction, and he was just spending his money in New York City and not really being aimless. And that's where drunk. And so the song, unlike Raindrops, which is also obviously going to be as a classic, everyone will always remember that the song as like a way to be inspired and to sort of be positive. It really has very little to do with the plot of the Hole in the Wall gang, played by Redford and Newman in that film, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Whereas I think this song goes very well with the film, and it really, in a way, cements the film and really allows the film to maybe, for some people, to be considered a comedy classic forever. I don't know if we're ever going to recommend it, but I can definitely recommend that music.
50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and have something new in each of those decades. And by the 90s, it was the nostalgia that he was bringing up that inspired the Austin Powers movies, and he actually appeared in them. And
right.
Michael Myers said that was like having Gershwin appear in your movie. Like, it was such a
right. In the first Austin Powers film, he shows up actually playing the piano and singing there. Look, Burt is, whether he recognizes Judaism or not, he definitely he was definitely channeling a little bit of the Noyam Zmiras Yisrael of David HaMelech there. Ending again. All right, my friends, I'm happy that we were able to deal with these three Burts. And watch your step on the way out. We'll see you next time. Be well. Thanks for joining us for another episode from the Yeshiva of Newark at IDT Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you don't miss a single episode.